takes a little bit to get that going on that front. So what we're going to do next, we are going to begin broadcasting to our Zoom audience. And so as you're funneling in, hello, please feel free to take a moment and get yourself a glass of water, a cup of tea, whatever it is you might need to be comfortable, because we are going to be walking through some really cool things today. So once I see that some of the participant lists have begun to stabilize, that is when we will plan to get going. So let's just give it another 20 seconds here. All right. So today, I am so honored to have Dr. Iheoma Iruka on from the University of North Carolina, and she does quite a bit of work for the Frank Porter Graham CDI. And so today she's going to be discussing her work both in that position and in some of the other positions she holds. And she'll be talking to us about addressing opportunity gaps and the education debt through a racial equity lens. And I must say, this is one that I personally am so excited for, because as those of you who have been on these calls a little bit know, I love data so much, and to meet with somebody who is in the top of a data field is just, you know, a little bit of a celebrity moment. For those of you who are unfamiliar with this or with myself, my name is Michael Taylor. I'm the Membership Development Manager for Early Learning Ventures. We are a shared services nonprofit, which means we partner with childcare providers and other ECE entities in order to help stabilize the entire field. So typically here, during these talks, what I end up doing is talking about the various products and programs we do. The only thing I want to highlight today is just that you can follow all of that information about us on our social media, both on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And what I really wanted to just talk about is also where ELV is, since those of you on the call, I see a lot of familiar names, and you're probably just curious how we're doing it within our own team. And so first and foremost, we started near the beginning of last year by having some team-wide racial equity trainings. And actually, I do need to give a shout out to our former guest speaker, Kim Desmond. She's our consultant, really got us jump-started on this work. And she is also San Diego's first ever Chief Race and Equity Officer. So very excited for her. And one of the first things that she really taught us and made sure that we understood is the need to define what we see as equity and racial equity. And so, ideally, race and ethnicity can no longer be a predictor of disparities within systems, and specifically education. Where we are now with this work, we're currently looking inwards. So that is using this racial equity mindset over all the different kinds of processes and collaborations we do. And then myself specifically, as I talked about, I'm a little bit of the data person. And so I had a very exciting aha moment this week of just realizing that my wildlife background of data is actually going to be effective in social data as well. So really excited, thanks to our partners with Child Care Aware of America. Dr. Dion Dobbins has really helped send over some resources that helped me as well. So in about the next month or so, I will be sharing out a paper just looking at how the pandemic affected child attendance during the pandemic. So I've looked at that across age groups and suburban, urban, rural, but I'm really excited to dive into this from the racial equity lens. But again, I really didn't want to spend a lot of time because I am wanting to be a listener today. So I want to just hand it over to Dr. Iheoma. And if there is anything else I can be doing for you during the presentation, let me know. But otherwise, I'm just going to take a step back.
Thank you, Michael, for that. I am so really pleased and honored to be here with each and every one of you, including those who are with me live and those who are at home or in their office or in their car listening, and those who will watch it eventually, and on Facebook. So I'm just so honored. And I want to particularly thank Ty Johnson, Michael Taylor, and of course, Milana Boris and the whole ELV team for allowing me to enter your space. I'm very happy to be here with you all, especially on a Friday, right? So for me, I'm at East Coast, so it's 3 o'clock, and I've been up since 3 a.m. So I'm not sure what you're gonna get, but hopefully it is gonna be something that'll keep you up at least for the next, let's say, 55 minutes. So again, thank you. So I'm gonna start by sharing my screen to just kick us off. Again, so grateful and thankful to be here with you all. And I'll be talking with you about how do we solidify our villages. And I use that word village really intentionally because part of, I really come and center my work around African centeredness, and really villages, and even in other countries, villages really signifies sort of a group that's coming to sort of bring you together and protect our young ones from all of the adult issues and stuff. So, and that's what early learning should be. And that's obviously what ELV is. It's really a community that's trying to make sure that children are protected and affirmed and really supported to be their best selves. And really, because I come with a very clear and strong racial equity lens, I want to make sure that the work that we do is really centered on the issues of both historical racism, as well as, all the systemic inequities that's still with us. Again, thank you. And I am from UNC, and I'm both in the public policy department as well as the Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute. And I am also the founder and director of the Equity Research Action Coalition, which is really the reason I came back to UNC, is to really form that and to really launch this work, which is really centered around how do we make sure that we really bring together in a really authentic way research, practice, and professionals, but also policy organizations, agencies through a racial equity, anti-racist lens that really centers on the strengths and wealth of families, particularly families of color, but especially Black families and their children and their communities and their educators. So thank you so much again. And before I really start, I want to make sure that I really honor the native lands. And I should have put in the chat box a link. And actually, no, I'm going to stop sharing real quickly so that I can do that. I want to put in the chat box for those who may not have ever thought about the native land. I'm going to put a link in the chat box, and in that link, you can actually find out on whose land do you live on or grew up in, because I think it's really important that we recognize that we live and work and love on native lands. And so I want to make sure that, so for those who are in our Zoom world, there's a link. And if you use that tool, you can sort of find out, whose land you live on. And it's just important to take a moment to acknowledge and honor the indigenous inhabitants of the past and those who are still here, whose lands we live on, love, work on, etc., and inhabit. And this honoring really opens up really greater public consciousness of Native sovereignty and cultural rights. And it's really a step towards sort of, I would say, actually healing, right? For those who are part of the tribal communities, when they hear that we really do honor and understand that we are living, working, and loving on their land, it helps them realize that we are part of the history, but also part of the healing that needs to happen. And so it's time that we begin to reflect on and honor their ancient knowledge and their wisdom. So feel free to use the link and really find out whose land that you inhabit and either worked on or work on, live or grew up on. So again, thank you. And then I also want to make sure that we honor Black bodies, because many parts of the US was built by enslaved Africans and their enslaved descendants. And only really within the past generation, my generation really, where Black people were afforded full rights as humans. And we know today that Black people and individuals, and even in some instances, other people of color, disproportionately work as service staff across the country. This community is really largely responsible for the maintenance of our daily lives, the food and food service that's available, childcare as we know it, of course, healthcare, and many other basic necessities that make our lives easy, that allow us to generate our own wealth, right? While they continue to subsidize all of that. And the wealth of our nation is due to the forced free labor of these Africans. All right, so I want us to make sure that we continue to remember that throughout our time together. I want to make sure I put my time on, so I want to give enough time for us to reflect together and have questions. For those who have questions, feel free to put in the chat, and I know either Marlena and or Michael will be looking out for those questions and comments. So I want to make sure that we have some time built in for that. And so just so for those who may not know me, you're like, who was Iheoma? What name is that? What, so I would say that I have indigenous roots. I was obviously born here in Texas, not obviously, but I was born here, I was raised here, etc. But I have roots both in Africa, but I have a lot of identities, right? So my name gives maybe a particular identity, but I would say I'm a Black woman. I'm a mother of two kids who you see there, young children. So they live in the early childhood space. So I not only do I work in it, do scholarship, but I also live it. I'm a wife, I'm a Christian, scholar. I live in North Carolina now, raised in Boston. I went to various schools up and down the East Coast and so much more. And I share that with you because those are all both identities that I carry at the same time. And so I want you to think about, what identities do you carry? But not only what identities do you carry, which ones have privilege, particularly say when you're at work, right? Is it your gender? Is it your race? Is it your gender identity? Is it your, your sexuality? Is it your religion, right? Or the language you speak or the country you were born in? Which one gives you privilege, right? Because a lot of our identities, some of them give us privilege, like, right? For me, I'm a scholar, I got a PhD, right? And some of us not necessarily, right? Depending on the space you walk in, being a woman, Black, etc. So just think about sort of, how does your social identity guide both how you represent yourself in the world and the work you do, but also how others receive you, and what kind of lens do you bring to the work? So just, take a moment. You can either, if you feel like you are brave or want to, and I would love it, feel free to share with those who are with us in Zoom land here, who, what are your identities that represent you the most, but also think about it yourself. What identities do you most identify, right? Some people is more their race for some reason, and for some people is not. Maybe ask yourself why or why not. Okay. And then I want to kind of make sure that people understand that when I enter the space and I talk about issues of racial equity and oppression, that you understand. And I love, for me, this take from Malcolm X, where he says, speaking like this does not mean that, he says, we are, but I'm anti-white, but it does mean that I am anti-exploitation, I'm anti-degradation, and I'm anti-oppression. And I think that's really my whole being, is that it's not about being an anti against any race, creed, color, but it's really around, I am actually against any form of oppression, any form of inequities, and any form of exploitation. And unfortunately, the US, because of this construction, really first attempted eradication of natives, and then the continued enslavement of Black people, and eventually other groups of people, really speaks to the importance of making sure that we center that the oppression that both historically but also presently in many different forms is not all about chains, but there are many chains that we're still walking with that still oppresses a lot of people from really reaching their potential. And of course, for those who are like, okay, I'm getting uncomfortable, I gotta leave. And before you leave, I wanted to give you this take-home message, no matter what, which is that first and foremost, for me, I don't even argue any longer whether racism exists. I don't even think that's a question, but that racism is part of our everyday lives, from the interactions we have to the environments that we are part of. It's literally the air that we breathe. It's like the fish who comes out of the water says, oh my God, where's my home? Like, we literally breathe, we are the fish, we swim in it. Every single one of us swim in racism. And racism is not about a person. It is an embedded system. It's part of our history. It is often invisible to many people who don't live it or think about it. And it operates with or without you. But what is most important, especially for those in the early care education sector, is that we have to understand that it creates trauma, right? We can talk about the adverse child experiences, right? Whether it's about children who will live in with abuse, children who experience families with mental health challenges, or children who may experience, certain specific things. But racism is so insidious and so invisible that we don't actually think a lot about it. And so that's something important that we must recognize, that while it may be invisible, it's literally part of a system that we all help to maintain, or we have to actively dismantle in many ways. And we must engage in what I call richer actions. And so I hope to give you something to actually do if you really want to continue the journey of self-inquiry and combating racism. And again, I use the word journey because I myself am still on a journey. And so I say that if you're not on the journey, you are here. So you must be somewhere. You must be on a train, on a chair somewhere. So I want you to employ to continue to read, engage, lean in, and also feel okay being held accountable when you may have done something wrong. But it doesn't mean that you are canceled. You are just being held accountable. Because doing nothing is actually condoning racism, right? So the person that sits on a sideline or even sits on the fence is actually condoning racism. You have to actually be active in the combating of racism and in the active disruption and dismantling of a system of oppression, which is what racism is. Okay, so some common, I think it's always important that we at least have same common language as I sort of continue. Because language is important. That's how we all sort of connect, at least in this community together today at this moment. So I want to make sure that I at least define racism, right? So that people walk away not thinking, oh, I hate this person, that must be racism. And we tend to throw out terms like he's racist, she's racist, they're racist. That's not, there's a specific term, right? So first and foremost, racism does operate at different levels, and it operates at really multiple levels. And really racism in its core, particularly structural racism, is the use of institutional power to organize around really white supremacy and the oppression, denigration, and dehumanization really based on skin color, right? This means that for the most part, that white people or people who look white or whiteness generally based on language and culture benefit from this system and arrangement of power, privilege, and resources. So just by being white and or looking white, you actually benefit from a system because it's been organized to really work for you. So whether it's around issues around housing, around education, yes, you may not have been part of constructing the racism part that has actually separated or at least provide inequitable access based on skin color and or where you live, but you benefit as a white person or somebody who looks white because the system operates to really benefit white people, right? So where whiteness is really regarded as the default, the one that's beautiful, the one that's intelligent and worthy, and something that we all should aspire to, right? So that in of itself maintains a racist system, right? And also, and racism system is systemic, right? Which means it's maintained really at society level, right? Based on who we always view as privileged, as better, no matter, even if they open their mouth, right? It's also done at the institutional level, right? When we have discriminatory policies and practices within organizations that says who gets to be the director, who gets to be the leader, right? We have our 14, the Fortune 500 companies, and there's probably a handful that are all actually people of color, right? That tells you who gets to be a leader, who gets to be wealthy, who gets to say where our country goes. Even look at our presidency, right? Who gets to be the leader of the free world? Right? Those are all policies. Those are all things that we do maintain in society, but also in our institutions. And there's also interpersonal racism, which is really the biases and bigotry that we show to individuals through words and action, right? Such as how we see children, and we sort of, we have the suspension of expulsion, one of the things that people talk about all the time. And because those are due to the racialized sort of lens that people look at certain groups of children, particularly Black and brown children, but especially Black children, and in particular Black boys, right? The fact that we often are prepared to throw them out because we believe their behaviors are harmful, even when they really don't even engage in any harmful behaviors, but are really just being babies and children. And of course, internalized racism, where people, begin to see themselves as less than because society tells them that they're less than, et cetera. So racism operates at many levels, but I would say the biggest one is really around structural racism, where we really have structured a system that says one group is better than another, and we have actually systematized it. So from the banking laws to segregation to who we decide to prosecute or not. So it really is part of the fabric of the institution that we have created in the US. And then there's biases, right? So again, every one of us have biases. And it's important that we don't assume that, oh, because you're white, you have biases, because you're a person of color, you don't. We all have biases because it's a cognitive process that every one of us have, because our brain has to process things. And that's the beauty of being a human. We can process things quickly, right? Based on experiences, our language, what we heard. That's just part of normal ones. But the implicit bias in particular is one that's not really under our control. And it can lead to either favorable or unfavorable characterizations of other people. So for example, we just see, when you hear the name Sam is being disruptive, what comes to your head, right? It comes a particular gender, maybe a particular race, maybe where they grew up, maybe their home. There's a whole lot of things that come up that then says, I'm going to treat this person a particular way in many ways because of all of those processes we made about the name Sam, the word, troubled behavior, challenging behavior, etc. Right. So think about what biases do you hold, and just again, it's not about a judgment of yourself, but about what do they make you think and do. If you hear the name Jawan, living in Chicago, it's the South Side. What does that make you think? And then what does that make you do if you were confronted with a Jawan? Again, the reason why implicit bias and racism, I always put them together, is that we need to understand how they kind of interplay together. One is there's the structural pieces that we have put in place, right? Whether it's in terms of inequity, which is the racism, in terms of whether it's voting rights, segregation, jobs, that who we hire in certain positions. Those particular history and practices lead to actual disparities, right? So the fact that I say you can only live in this neighborhood that is not only poor quality, has poor tax infrastructure, has all the environmental toxins, that's going to lead to a particular kind of disparities, right? In many ways, whether it's due to whether it disparities in health, education, outcomes, opportunities, etc. That those disparities actually then eventually create this dominant narrative that this group is less than, they're lazy, they're poor, they're dangerous. And so the structural racism, the practices and policies and the history before us created the racial disparities and the inequitable outcomes because we created the opportunity gaps, as many of us talk about, right? But those have been institutionalized. And because they create those disparities, and then people actually really are poor, they really don't, they really have, poor health because we created that. And then we have this primary association about certain groups of people, again, that was institutionalized, and it maintains that cycle. And part of the job that we should always do is question, why do we think a particular way, and what have we done to create that particular outcome and or those disparities? So the role of what we have to do is both question ourselves as to, why do I have those biases? Why is it that those same patterns hold? No matter what, we know that the disparities around race holds no matter what outcomes we're looking at. Every single outcome, you can literally pin who is going to be primarily at the bottom because that has been institutionalized. This is what we call a structural racism and systemic racism. So we really, and so that's why I keep saying thank you for allowing me to enter your space, because we are at a crossroads, right? One, right now we are still in a pandemic. So I know some people thought we were free, but we are not free yet from the pandemic. We are still doing the COVID-19, and hopefully we continue to take it really seriously. But not only that, we're also doing racial reckoning that started in the summer. But really, in the end of it, I don't know if it's a reckoning, because in the end of it, things have to change for it to really be recognized. So I'm hoping, obviously, because we are here together, you are in this room with me, that you are still on that journey in some way or another. So I'm going to say that we are still in the reckoning stage, thankfully. For some people, they've already moved on, like I'm done. And some people are still like, I'm still on this journey. So thank you for still being on that journey and still pushing to lead us to equity, hopefully to that full liberation we're looking for. But we're also at the same time getting all the generational, as they call it, generation change funding from the federal government, really, especially within early care education and for families with young children. That has not been done in at least 40, 50 years, right? So we are at this moment where there's a lot happening. And the question is, what will you do if you are a leader of an early care education program, if you're a director, if you're a provider, whatever you are, right? We are at a moment where we have a lot of things happening. Again, I'm just mentioning I have a couple of them. There's so much more, but imagine we are still in a pandemic. We are still fighting for what I would say is racial freedom and advancing racial equity, as the Biden administration has articulated. We are still this funding coming to early care education, and we are in those intersection of pandemic, racial reckoning, and funding coming to early care education. What will you do? Right? That's why I have hashtag WWYD. What will you do, no matter what your role is? And I would say part of that is that we're going to have to continue to push for equity, which is that everyone has a fair and just opportunity to thrive and reach their potential. And this means that we have to remove all obstacles. And to me, racism and all of its forms and biases are literally obstacles that's in an everyday, every second, moment to moment obstacle we have to eradicate. And specifically racial equity, because that is the foundation of this country. And so racial equity is what, and so I'm so thrilled to know that the Early Learning Ventures team is doing internal and external work to really not only make that visible, but also to work on its internal drivers and internal processes to address racial equity. Because at the end of it, it's about everyone has a fair and just opportunity to thrive and reach their potential, regardless of their race and skin color. Unfortunately, that's not where we are, right? We are not there, because in the end of it, equity is about, do I have access? That's one. But when I get it, am I going to have equitable experiences in those spaces and those services? And am I going to have the same outcomes? Right? A lot of times we focus on one or the other, but not all three. To me, equity is really about, give me the fair and just opportunity to thrive, no matter what my race, my skin color, but also other identities that are marginalized, right? Whether it's your language, whether it's your gender or gender identity, or whether your neuro, development skill, or your disability, or your religion. Like, in the end of it, while I still center race as the biggest one, right? People try to avoid that one, don't avoid it. There are other identities that are also oppressed and marginalized, and we need to make sure that those identities are not marginalized, or people with those identities are not marginalized in any shape or form in our early education. So we have to address equitable access, experience, and outcomes if we're trying to get to equity. When I think about early care education, the problem is that we do, to some extent, have a level of access, at least for certain groups of children. Not, again, not equal, but the issue is you can give access. We know, for example, that Black children in particular, about 60, 75% of Black children are in some sort of out-of-home care by the age of 1. The problem is that when they get some of that access, is actually not even a good one, right? So this is data, and I won't go through it. And I don't know, Mike, you said you love data. I only have a few data points here for you, Michael, but it's still good data from the Department of Education, the Early Child Longitudinal Study Birth Cohort. And what this is showing you, and I'll just briefly walk through it, is that the blue coloring basically is low quality. The red coloring is medium quality, whatever that means, right? And the green one is as high quality. And that's based on the sort of some of our quality improvement system ratings generally. And so we have center-based and home-based for the total group. And so on average, no matter what, majority of kids are in low to medium quality care. And if it's medium, it's still low in my head, just to be honest. I don't know what medium is. I know what it is, but it's still not good quality. It's not high quality, right? So on average, many children, no matter your race, and that's the total on the left-hand side, are right here, are experiencing really what I would say is low quality to medium quality care. Even for home-based program is even worse, right? Again, based on the metrics, and we can talk about whether we have the right metrics for home-based providers and programs. But if we look at white children, it's still bad, right? We're talking about 64% of children, the quality of programs for white children is still low, it's still bad and home-based. But of course, when we go to sort of Black children and Latino children, for Black children especially, 3 out of 4 in center-based programming that's supposed to be higher quality are not experiencing, high quality ratings. The same thing for Latinos, about 60% of those programs are considered low to medium quality care. And of course, home-based, they just think that, primarily Black children, Latino children, just in low quality to medium quality home-based program. Again, we could argue the details about the measures, but what it does tell us that even when you get access, the quality is still not at the level that we need. And I would argue even our programs considered high quality are not even good enough still, particularly for our Black and brown children. And we see the same thing with Head Start. So this is the Head Start program, right? The percentage of distribution of quality for Head Start centers that, again, Head Start has been with us for a generation. They provide holistic, whole child, whole family support. But again, even with all the performance standards and with the support, we still see disproportionately that Black children in particular are likely to be in low to moderate or medium quality care. They're less likely to be in this green bar, which is high quality care. This tells you that even when it's even the same program, the same standards across many places, that Black children writ large, excuse me, are likely to be in low quality care. So that just tells you a pattern that is the case. And there's many reasons for that, but that's still a pattern. And of course, we have the fact that many Black children still experience sort of these biased interactions and trauma. The same thing with some brown children as well, with Latino children in particular, where you're having, them arrested in what should be safe and protected places. And so again, you could talk about access, but what about quality of experiences? Excuse me. This is what happens when you talk all week and then you don't drink your tea to moisturize your throat. So again, even with when we think about sort of the experiences of Black and brown children, and we now overlay with the pandemic, where a lot of children of color, Black children, Latino children, and Native children were likely to experience a lot of loss and trauma, and children all around, right, regardless of race, ethnicity, were experiencing that because obviously they had loss of their regular routines. They probably had loss of life. But we know there's disproportionality in terms of Black, Latino, and Native American children, where a lot of their families were either lost or were displaced because even the disproportionality of the impact of racism. When you have a system that continually says that you're going to be underemployed, essential workforce, you're likely going to be poor, so that when a pandemic hits, you have no resources, no reserves to address basic resources like utility. So this is the problem, where a lot of children probably have been experiencing some grave challenges directly and indirectly, again, because of both systemic racism and the inequities that have existed because, again, of your race and or your culture and or your community. So now when I talk about equitable, what's equity? I talk about access, but also about experiences, but also outcomes. And so this is the data again, and this might be my last data, but this is data that basically, and I'll walk you briefly through it, that was done by Michael Little and using a national data, also from the U.S. Department of Education. But really what it does show is really something really important that I think we should all think through. So this data compares Black, Latino, Asian, and other races, which includes our multiracial and our Native children. And it compares them to how they're doing compared to white children. And really, if the 0 is the average, so if you're below this line, that means that you're doing not as well as white children. And so this is the blue, the light blue is really fall of kindergarten, which is basically the year they just came from pre-K, preschool. So this is the fall K, and the spring of kindergarten is the darker blue. And then the red is the spring of first grade. And the first bar I'm showing is around reading, and then the right-hand side is about math. But what I want to show you really is where you see there's a little bit in terms of reading that Black children compared to white children are not doing as well after they leave pre-K and enter kindergarten. And so you see the gap continues, is not as big compared to Latino children, but it's still a gap there. And it's a little bit of a mixed bag with the group under other races. Again, we could talk about that because obviously the issue of you don't want to identify children, so they lump other race together. But then you do see that Asian children are doing better than white children. It decreases over time, but it's still, they're doing better, relatively better. And the same pattern holds for math, and is a bit more of a gap between Black children and white children compared to Latino children and white children, but the gap that we saw in reading still persists. And a couple of things I just want to say about this particular slide, as you kind of look at it yourself, is number one, it's not about the children themselves. It's about, now, if you think about what I said already about the historical legacy we still are experiencing, if we talk about the experiences that Black children, Latino children, other children of color experience while they're in preschool, again, this is not an indictment of all early care education. And I don't think that it's because of early care education that these gaps exist primarily, right? There's a lot of complex reasons for that, but it does also question who is the standard, right? So we have Asian children higher than white children, but who should be the standard? That's one. The second one really is that even within this, there are children who are doing really well, who are Black, Latino, Native, other children. And so this kind of doesn't tell the full story. So something to think about is that there's diversity even within each group. even within the Asian group, we know they're not all the same as well. So how do we begin to unpack some of that diversity even within groups and show their own diversity within that? But also, so again, I want to make sure you leave this, not to think that there's something wrong with children, particularly children of color. As a mother of two brilliant, excellent children, right? It's not about the children's ability. One is whether we provide the opportunities to show and elicit their brilliance, whether the metrics we use are fully capturing their brilliance, and really who should be the standard in terms of what we should be reaching out for in terms of high quality. But I will point out that the gaps still remain, even for when we look at things on the called numbers reversed, which are really executive function skills about whether children have working memory or cognitive flexibility. So in the end, we see the gaps are even bigger. But again, these data in particular really tell us that children are really, they're dealing with a lot of challenges that is not due again to their fault. It's really adult decision making, in particular the structure that we have created where certain groups of children are experiencing more toxicity, they're experiencing more adversity. And when you're experiencing adversity, whether it be from food, shelter, the environment, the community environment, we are placing that on children. And of course, their outcomes will not reflect all of that. And so we need to begin to pay attention to not the fact that, oh my God, Black children are not doing well. Latino, yes, we should focus on that. But we should unpack the reason as to why. How does your access and how do your experiences actually then eventually impact your outcomes? So now I want to play this video. Hopefully it does it for me. And hopefully I have my audio. I wanted to make sure I have my audio. Let me stop sharing real quickly. Make sure I have my audio there. Yes, I did. I want to make sure so I don't play without the audio. And I want you to watch the video and just, it's about 2 minutes. I'm not going to be too long. And just, think through it and tell me, at least think about it even within yourself. You can share in the chat box, but let's watch the video and see if it plays. Here we go.
Quale bambola è bianca? Quale bambola è nera? Quale delle due è bella?
Questa.
Qual è quella bella? Qual è quella brutta? E qual è quella buona? Quale è cattiva? Qual è buona?
Lei.
Perché è buona?
Perché ha gli occhi celesti.
Quale è cattiva? Perché è cattiva?
Perché è tutto nero.
E qual è la bambola che ti somiglia di più?
So, so I want you to just, even I watched it many times before, and there's actually an American version. I decided to show the Italian version on purpose so that people understand and recognize that sort of I would say particularly anti-Black racism, but just, how Black is often viewed across the globe is this colonization. But also to look at the faces and the eyes of children as they basically tell you what society tells them. They're basically reflecting back what they have heard in many spaces. And so what is, for you to think through, what does this video make you feel and think? You can put in a chat box or just, think about it yourself. But just imagine, when I talked about the equity, it is both about access, or it's also about experiences. And to me, early care education, part of what they should be doing is to make sure that children don't experience this idea that they're not good, that they're bad, um, in many ways. And that's what a lot of children, particularly children of color, and especially Black children and brown children, experience from the world around them, right? And so our job is to continue to endow them with a lot of worth about who they are. So, just take a couple of seconds and just, either put that in a chat box or just think to yourself about what that video says to you. So, yeah. I know it never gets easy. Thank you for sharing. Like that's a punch in the gut, and it's heartbreaking, especially for those who may have Black and brown children. That this is what they feel and say. And imagine when a kid is like, I said that doll is bad, and then I have to now say, yeah, I look like that doll. But again, I want to make sure that people understand that even when kids get those messages, they could still have really positive self-identity. So I also want to make sure that even though we kids know that, a lot of kids of color know that, yes, that doll that looks like me is often viewed as bad, and not good, and all the negative words, but they themselves may still feel like, I am somebody, I am worthy, etc. And so it's just important for us to recognize and realize that racism does lead to child trauma. So when you think about all the conversations happening around adversity and all these things, that we begin to really make sure that we center racism and race-based traumatic stressors, because it really presents itself in many ways when children begin to show fear, anxiety, helplessness, and they begin to react to what they're hearing about themselves or those who look like them. That in of itself something we need to recognize, right? So children may be misbehaving from your eyes, but is it really them, or they responding to society's continual push against their own humanity? And Black children in particular are particularly vulnerable to racial trauma because they don't even have the words, because we adults don't even have the words. We try to avoid any conversation about racism. Like if somebody says racism, most of us are out the room, right? But somebody says something about, poverty or ability, or like there's certain things that we are okay with doing, but we may not be as comfortable. So again, think through the lens of what are we doing in terms of making children feel comfortable in who they are. And children know these things early on in life. So that's something for us to remember, that children really realize a lot of these things early, as well. And then I just want to share my last few minutes. I want to leave time for us to discuss, as much as possible. What can you do? So I want to just share this report that me and many other national organizations from the Children's Equity Project, which was the lead of this work, in collaboration with my own entity called the Equity Research Action Coalition at UNC FPG, that we did really around starting with equity, 14 priorities to dismantle systemic racism in early care education. And really, and we had a partnership with NAYC, the National Black Child Development, the Child Welfare, the Indian Child Care Coalition Group, and Build, and so many other national partners who engage with us in this work. And really, I would say it really does cover the big areas of how do we ensure equitable access, experience, and outcomes in early care education, really to dismantle racism. And that includes things like equitable funding, really true authentic integration, and centering family child care homes and friend and family neighbor, because that's where most children are, to making sure that we don't have inequitable access and or experiences in early intervention and special education. And then when we think about experiences, how do we make sure that the workforce is supported but really paid? As I say, hashtag show them the money. That we think about, how do we think about equity in our quality improvement systems and our other quality initiatives? How do we think about assessments, right? We think that all the global quality, they don't measure things around equity and or biases and or cultural wealth and the things that may matter really for certain groups of children. What about eliminating harsh discipline and suspension, ensuring access to that children who are dual language learners and speak other languages and or other dialects like African American English vernacular, really, provide with equitable access. And thinking about family leadership and how we make sure that our programming and services really center the families rather than centering programs themselves. And then how do we ensure that we have really what I consider anti-bias, culture responsive curriculum and pedagogy, right? If you're not centered on your own biases, all of us have them. If you're not centered on how to make sure that we are dismantling racism in our classroom, in our program, then we're going to perpetuate it, even no matter if we have the best curriculum. And then, of course, how do we continue to monitor our outcomes to ensure equitable outcomes for those who have been historically marginalized through our monitoring and accountability standards, and also through our continuous quality improvements. So in many ways, we try to identify policies that we can immediately act upon, whether it's our CCDBG, whether it's the Office of Head Start work, whether it's our quality improvement systems. So we really identify policies that you can begin to push on to move things forward. And so I won't go through, I didn't plan on going through all 14 at all. And I encourage you to read the report, because I think no matter whether you're an educator, in the classroom or in the program, but I think if you're a leader, no matter what everybody's a leader. So no matter your station, I think that there's something there for every single person that you can activate. And then finally, I want to just give some thoughts to you about how can you engage in anti-racist and anti-bias work, because at the end of it, you can't go doing work on children, for children, without at least knowing how to do that in a way that really centers your biases, but also centers your knowledge. And so I call this being richer, right? So how do you go through that process? One is you have to actually re-educate yourself about history, and about the US history that includes Black history, that includes also Native history, right? If we don't have the grounding about how our country started from 1419 to 1619, if you don't have some of those grounding, then you're likely to just miss out on all the things that we're talking about in terms of oppression and addressing racial equity. And we know that a lot of our textbooks, including the ones that I felt like I read in high school and college, that I had to go and do my own on learning and relearning. So this requires re-education by history. And fortunately, we have, between the Library of Congress to Hulu, to Netflix, to everything else, that we can all learn, and a lot of podcasts, including a lot of webinars, recorded webinars, and YouTube. So there's a lot of places to re-educate ourselves about our own history. And of course, that it's important to integrate rather than desegregate. We focus so much on desegregation, which was a first step, but we never fully integrated. So thinking about integration, not just from the movement of bodies, but from the how do we integrate all of our knowledge, right? The communities that you work and live in and love on, like how do we make sure that we are integrating, all of the richness, whether it's around, make sure that people of color are part of the leadership, a part of your thinking, a part of all the work, right? That's integrated between white people and other people of color. We really need to begin to that integration. And of course, you have to critique everything, right? You have to ask yourself, not about what's wrong with those kids or those families, but to ask yourself, why is this happening? What are the things that are going into the policies of programming or practices? We have to begin to really be critiques, even critiquing me and what I'm saying, right? But critique everything, but with the idea that we're trying to learn and be better, right? Show humility of privilege, right? We, as I mentioned earlier in the first part, if you know at least the privilege that you stand on, that's a place of activation where you can activate and be the change agent. So really both being privileged in that you probably have food in the fridge, that you probably have food over that you have roof over your head, right? Those are the things that we all are thinking about, but that's a privilege for many people, especially in the pandemic. And then of course, to focus on race and racism, right? We focus on everything else under the sun, right? Think of it, we're gonna put our heads in there. When it concerns racism, which is a journey and a collective work, we need to continue to push on that. And of course, we have to re-envision different ways and approaches, right? Who we talk to, how we think about things, how we look at our data, measure, right? It's good to gap gaze, but you got to actually do something eventually. And the reason why I call it the richer framework is because I do believe it will make our country enriched, right? Because what it'll do is that it will limit the dehumanization and the oppression of people. It will help to eradicate racism and biases in all aspects, because we are all knowledgeable about our history. We've all began to really deeply integrate and connect with people in different places. We know our privilege, and we're really actively working on erasing racism, because each of us are active players in maintaining it, whether we like it or not. And we'll also be those who are creating new programming and new ways of being, whether through programming, policy, and or research. So I leave you today again with this take-home message that, right, that racism is really part of who we are. It is built into everything that we do, including early care education, I wrote a book, last year, or at least I wrote it actually a few years ago, but it was released last year, and good or bad, it's part of, I think, a lot of early childhood's book studies and different webinars, etc. Right? Because I realized at the end of it, I wanted to make sure that at least I share where I am with all those around me, because racism is part of the air that we breathe, and we have to continue to undo that. Right? I'm still on a journey, learning still about the country that I was born in and raised in. Right? And so I have to continue to actively work to learn more and do more, and learn how is it embedded, including early care education, right? From what we know about early care education is part of that. And we can't ignore that just because we love babies, that we really are doing all the best that we can to not continue to maintain racism. And so it really operates with and without you, and really does create trauma, whether you see it or not. And to me, part of really not just seeing it and looking at it is actually actively make sure that we're learning more about it, right? And that's why I have the richer framework, that we have to continue to do self-inquiry, and also continue to mobilize our own networks, right? If you're really a white male, for example, who may be feeling like, oh my goodness, all this, I have no privilege anymore because I'm not a woman, I'm not a person of color, I don't got anything going on, right? But knowing that you are still a president of the country, a president of a company, but still recognize that in any ways, if you're on a journey, you can help those who are in your networks also to be on a journey to combat racism. And that what we all should continue to do is lean into the journey. And again, as I say, we should all be held accountable, especially those of us who are privileged and in power, and our white allies, is that we have to make sure that being held accountable, again, is not about being cast aside, right? That you're being held accountable, but you're still part of the community that's going to help to continue to move things. And again, I speak like this because I'm really about, anti-exploitation, degradation, and oppression, right? That should be all that we are a part of. And I really, again, thank you for allowing me to be in this space on a Friday in the summer. And again, and I hope we can have a little bit of conversation. And I think we have some time, which is great. And you can follow me on Twitter and other Iheoma and other social channels. And I'll give you these resources, both if you get the PowerPoint, you can click on them, but they're also in this resource page. But again, there's so many people doing this work that I hope that you will be open to continue on the journey, continue to learn and read and engage. So thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Iruka. I personally have a couple questions, but they're sort of deep in the weeds kind of things. So what I would love to do first is to just give it a couple minutes to see if there were any questions about Dr. Iruka's talk, about her work. So again, a reminder, you will be receiving a recording of this presentation. You'll be receiving a copy of all of Dr. Iruka's slides, and you will also be receiving a series of resources from her that are pretty awesome. So definitely check those out. And so, Dr. Iruka, while we wait on other questions to come in, something that was a big oop for me as we were going through there was the relationship between QRIS ratings and between race for children. And so what I find interesting about that is one of the things that I've been looking at comes out of a study from North Carolina, the child care market rate study that was put out in 2018. And so that found that there was this, the study found that many of the state's largest cities actually had lower prices at the higher rated QRIS sites. And so this is where I am so interested when you bring in these multiple facet data points. I'm curious, you as full-time researcher, how do you bring in the pricing, QRIS, and raise into that? Man, phew,
there's so much, right? It's
yeah.
it's like a 3D, 4D dimensional work, right? But I think I without going into too much of the technical geekiness, that right, because for those of us who love math and numbers, is first and foremost is begin to kind of unpack it a little bit. One is to look at, okay, what cities are we talking about? Because you'll see a similar pattern, say even with say TANF. And in TANF, where you have a majority sort of Black community in particular, you will see the eligibility or the amount of money that actually gets to families is much lower. And so if we take the QRIS, we're going to ask the question of, okay, what cities are there? What is the population like? and to what extent, or is the cost of living. So there's other things. But what we do find is that when you do overlay race with some of these things, you may realize that at the end of it, there's a level of racial disparities that exist, in that it may be that we're asking a lot of Black owned or minority owned programs to actually do all these things, but not actually pay them for it. So basically, is that we're subsidizing basically all the programming. If you look at the pay, if we even look at just even the workforce pay issue, right? So this is where you take the workforce pay issue and you see in the end of it that there's some group of women, or who are primarily women in the workforce at least, that are getting paid, $30 an hour, have benefits, all that. But there's a whole nother group who happen to also be women of color in community-based programs who are not getting $30 an hour. They're getting more like $14.38 an hour. That is a huge disparity. And not only are they getting less money, they're not getting the benefits. And with COVID-19, we saw that those were the women, primarily who were women. There was, of course, the men who were actually going to have to figure out PPE and all those things. They had to be essential workforce. And those in the school-based programming, which were mostly, who are predominantly white women, did not have to deal with those issues. So in the end of it, the QRS is almost like a microcosm of society, where when you do have sort of, I hate to say, a majority Black or brown place, even when you are doing your best work, you're probably doing it at a high cost that you are probably subsidizing, which means that we're taking actually wealth out of the homes of people who don't even have wealth to begin with. Because again, structural racism has ensured that they were not, or they weren't included in all of the financial drivers. They didn't have homes because we didn't give them the financial stuff. So we can go on and ask the question of, why do we have, so then the question is, why do we have that, right? And so you can go down other policies and all that, but in the end of it, it's good to just have those queries so people know that we're not making these things up about sort of how racism actually continues to manifest in many ways and continues to harm people both financially, but also just psychologically.
Awesome, thank you. And also to drive home your point, one of the main things that came out of that study, and as we got involved and looked into it as well, is that childcare programs that meet higher quality standards oftentimes lose money, especially in infants and toddlers. So this is something we see oftentimes in Colorado, individuals that are not able to really pursue QRIS due to all kinds of needs. And part of the reason I brought up that QRIS specifically is because there is, on my end, I'm dealing with some noise around QRIS. So Early Learning Ventures, we serve 10% of all childcare providers in Colorado, but we're serving 30% of all of the families and children on subsidy in our state. So the little quirk about our state is everybody has to be a QRIS report. And so a lot of the private pay facilities do not bother with taking part in QRIS, but the ones that serve children on subsidy, that is their reimbursement rate. So they have to take part. Right. And so there's this very like weird relationship that I'm trying to figure out. And it's just,
So this is, I think you make a really good point. QRIS is actually a nice example, right? Where if you look at it, they're like, we're trying to create a market where we have equal, we at least have quality. We can manage quality, at least for children who are receiving public funds, right? That is usually the concept of it. But when you go and look deeper, at least in certain states, you'll see in essence, you're actually oversights board of those who are serving children from low income households, primarily in some places children of color. So that means that those who are higher income or serving higher income families and or white families predominantly are not doing any oversight. Right. So that means that basically, again, if you look at other sectors, this is the problem. You're receiving any kind of public funding. We go through and create all of these systems and paperwork and barriers, as I call them, to say we're going to police you to get money when we know the money doesn't actually cover the quality of care. There is most of the market rates tell us we're not paying full market prices. Somebody has to pay for that. But who pays for that? The workforce or the owner. And so now if you know that, for example, your children are going to need, infant or early childhood mental health consultant, they're going to need food, they're going to need all these other things. Who is subsidizing that? We're actually forcing the workforce who actually has no money and to actually subsidize for something that we all benefit from. I benefit from having childcare. Our best business benefit from having childcare. So the fact that we continue to ask women and women of color and women who have low wealth to subsidize a whole lot of wealthy people, at least people who have more money than they do, is the really the rationale of both racism, sexism, but also inequity, right? Because we have now institutionalized them to subsidize a system. So thank you for using our QRIS as an example of, again, good intention, but implementation is really one that we have to look deep at.
Thank you. That is beautiful. That basically you do the work that like I just think about constantly. So it is so fun to have you on to hear like how to go about it. Because I mean, just to let you know how, like, you know, I obviously working for ELV, I have to figure out what to do. Is that because we serve such a population of providers that serve subsidy, like we have a biased high QRIS average for our network. It looks good, but like, so what I've had to do is like temporal reporting. So looking how long individuals have been working with us to see that, to showcase that there is a direct trend line there. And so would you mind finally just sort of sharing what you meant by bifurcation as like a data concept, and, you know, why we have to have PhDs do data as opposed to lay people?
No, you don't need a PhD. And I know that we're up against the clock, but I'll just say, when I say bifurcated, I basically mean that even though we have this thing called early care education system, we do not have a system, because at the end of it, we literally have groups of people, like school-based, center-based programs, but really school-based programs, who actually operate through a different auspices, whether through their school district. And because you operate through the school district, what you're considered a teacher, quote unquote, you get benefits, you get paid, that's high, livable wages. But then if you're on the other side of childcare, babysitting, you're not called a teacher, and then you're not actually given those same exact benefits either. You're paid the $14, $11 an hour. So again, you have basically doing the same exact work, supporting and teaching and caring for the same groups of children, but depending on the auspices that you're in and who funds it and how you're called a teacher or not, is going to actually say the different lifestyle you're going to actually have and the benefits you have. So it's really two separate systems under a system that doesn't actually exist.
I think I have. I'm sure I'll lose it and remember and go back. That's
just rewind.
Exactly. Awesome. Okay, well, I know we are at time, and I definitely don't want to keep you. I know you're busy, so we'll get all of your resources out for you. We thank you so very much for this. I know there are quite a couple of our national partners that wrote me that are excited to watch this later on. So hi, those of you, and we will talk to you soon. So thank you so much, Dr. Iheoma, and have a great day.
You too. Take care. Be safe. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.